Hello, I'm Dr. Scott Wadier.
And I'm Tommy Welling, and you're listening to the Fasting for Life podcast.
This podcast is about using fasting as a tool to regain your health, achieve ultimate wellness, and live the life you truly deserve.
Each episode is a short conversation on a single topic with immediate actionable steps. We cover everything from fat loss and health and wellness to the science of lifestyle design.
We started Fasting for Life because of how fasting has transformed our lives, and we hope to share the tools that we have learned along the way. Hey everyone, welcome to the Fasting for Life podcast. My name is Dr. Scott Wadier, and I'm here, as always, with my good friend and colleague, Tommy Welling. Good afternoon to you, sir.
Hey, Scott, how are you?
Fantastic, my friend. Excited for today's conversation. We are going to be diving into a research article that just came out in January of 2024 out of the Frontiers in Nutrition journal. It's going to be the effects of different intermittent fasting regimens in people with type 2 diabetes, a network meta-analysis. Don't worry, as always, if you're new, welcome in, but we're going to distill it down into an actionable step you can take today to apply this to your fasting lifestyle. So if you are new and you want to get to know Tommy and I a little bit more, head back to episode 1, give it a listen. It will give you the origin story of how fasting transformed our lives, why we come to you week in and week out now, why we created coaching programs and free resources and Facebook communities and challenges and all of the things that we do now in the fasting space to help you regain control of your health, lose weight, reverse diabetes, etc. So I'm excited to have you listening in if you are new. If you're a long-term listener, appreciate the subscribe, rate, review, or the download, resubscribe, bookmark, share, whatever the things you click now, wherever you listen to your podcasts. We appreciate you sharing the message because we are going to take on the diabetes and obesity epidemic one person at a time. So, Tommy, I want to give a shout out to Wood-Style Shinobi, who posted, said, all caught up, 5-star review. By the way, those are our favorite kind. Thankfully,
Nice.
We have lots of those. I started listening to you guys in October 2023. I recently just finished listening to the entire backlog. So, you know what? First and foremost, shout out to you for being dedicated.
Right.
Because that's lot
commitment.
of hearing Tommy's voice. and mine too, of course.
So
I probably talk way more on these than he does. But anyway, definitely my favorite fasting-based podcast. Keep doing what you're doing.
wow.
Thanks for the shout out. The one thing I would enjoy to see you guys do would be interviews some more prominent people in the field of fasting. What? We're not prominent enough? Wood-Style Shinobi? No, totally get it.
That's cool.
Managing this one podcast has been enough, but we are working on figuring out how we can bring more content to y'all more consistently. So far, we're 230 something episodes in weekly without missing. So I'm going to pat myself on the back, pat you on the back in a virtual sense, Tommy.
Right.
And let's dive into today's topic, which is the effects of different intermittent fasting regimens in people with type 2 diabetes and network meta-analysis. And I want to start and tee this up for you. I want to kind of set the intention of like why they were doing, why they were looking at this and why they were trying to figure out like, why are we going to compare these different fasting types in type 2 diabetics, right? So when we look at it, the aim of it was to provide evidence-based medical advice for clinical dietary intervention in patients with type 2 diabetes. What I love about that starting point, is that we're not talking about necessarily from our perspective managing the disease, but we want to see changes in the metrics that they looked at, which I'll have you unpack here in just a second, that resulted in metabolic change, that resulted in not just a change in the BMI, right, which weight is weight, but change in the actual underlying blood work or labs or blood sugar that showed that we were not only managing, but potentially reversing prediabetes and diabetes. So that's where we want to dive in. And that's kind of the starting point. So I love this recent study on fasting and comparing the different fasting types. And then there were some winners, there were some losers. There's kind of a hodgepodge, and we'll explain kind of our take on what that looks like and how you can apply it.
Yeah. So when we're talking about like what are the metrics that really matter, that move the needle, what's going on under the hood, definitely especially applies to folks suffering from diabetes, but any number of blood sugar related disorders or comorbidities. But these all of these things are kind of on a spectrum of risk and of symptoms. Although we think about them oftentimes in black and white, yes or no, on or off. Am I diabetic or am I not diabetic, or do I have prediabetes or do I have diabetes? But at the same time, we build layers of insulin resistance. We can think of insulin sensitivity and resistance as layers. So if we find out what's going on under the hood and which one of our fasting methods works best, or to combat a certain issue or a certain part of the blood work, or maybe all of them all at once, then that can be helpful no matter where you are, how much weight you have to lose, or what amount of risk you have for blood sugar related issues. These are all very important. So even though this was designed for medical management for diabetes, it's applicable to everybody, frankly. And so the cool thing is, here we're looking at things like fasting glucose, but maybe a little bit more importantly, we're getting a little bit deeper. We go to HbA1c, which is our 90-day moving average of glucose essentially in the blood. We also have body mass index, which you talked about a little bit before, but also HOMA-IR, our measure of insulin resistance, which is a really good indicator of what's going on and how efficiently our body is actually dealing with elevated blood sugar, and how much insulin we're likely to push out at any given point to keep blood sugar within a more optimal range. And so the lower our level of insulin resistance, the better.
Yeah, and HOMA-IR is the gold standard. If you want to know more about that, you can head back, just search Fasting for Life, HOMA-IR. We've done a couple of specific episodes on that.
Mm-hmm.
So that's really the gold standard in the diagnosis of insulin resistance. And that's great. If you can't get it tested at home, it's something you'd have to order. Some doctors won't order it. It's only typically ordered right now in type 2 diabetics. It's not ordered as a preventative because no one knows how to interpret it in the medical system currently. So we like to look at that insulin number, the fasting plasma insulin or fasting insulin number, as an indicator of where we are. If it's less than 7, that's good. Less than 5 is more optimal. 7 or above, even though the range goes all the way up to 22, 24, depending on the lab, that's going to show that you have a much higher incident of developing diabetes and all of the comorbidities that come with it. So anything above 7, on a scale of 7 to 22 to up to 24, you can all be in the normal range. Well, we don't want normal for disease process measured against disease processes. We want optimal, right? So HOMA-IR is a really powerful, is the gold standard for looking at what's going on metabolically when it comes to your blood sugar management. So this study, meta-analysis. So what I loved about it is they looked at 13 studies, 867 patients were included. They looked at twice per week fasting. I'll have you define that in just a second. They looked at the fast mimicking diet, which we don't typically love. Time restricted eating. So that means different windows of where you would shrink, like fasting window 16-8, 18-6, 24, those types of things. And periodic fasting, which I thought is cool how they labeled that in terms of the category. And then they compared those to a conventional diet. And the results of the network comparison showed that there were a lot of similarities between the fasting regimens, and that they all showed improvements, and that the twice per week fasting was the best for a comprehensive type intervention for improvement. And how that differs from the 5-2, we'll unpack that in just a second. But the reality of it is that after we kind of go through each different type and compare it to conventional and then compare it to each other, there is no, for us, in our perspective, I don't know how to say this without being really blunt, none of these strategies would be what we would recommend.
Yeah. Yeah, there's some different ways to go about these different categories of fasting. But, what we've found over the last few years is that some combination here is necessary to balance out what's effective physiologically, what prevents things like fasting fatigue or fasting frustration in a very kind of predictable way, because if you're doing the same thing over and over again, even if it's effective at first, or even if it stays effective, it can get very bland and very hard to comply with and stick to over the long period of time. So we need a few different, effective tools that we can kind of use. And so we need to sharpen up some different tools in our fasting tool belt. And I wanted to expand on one point that you made, which was the fast mimicking diet that we don't typically, endorse very much, because fast mimicking diet is one that I've seen it explained in the research a few different ways, and we know different companies that sell or provide protocols to kind of be able to
Mimic fasting.
yeah, essentially mimic fasting,
Right.
fasting with food,
It was named
and
very aptly. It was very clear in the
yeah,
naming,
yeah. If you,
right?
I mean, it sounds silly at first glance, and it continues to almost kind of be silly even as you continue to go down with what the research results show for some of these protocols. And so basically bringing in food in a very strategic way, and sometimes it's plant based, sometimes it's under a certain number of calories, but it's timed out all throughout the day to basically be bringing in food, but a lot less food, and to lower the insulin response in theory when that food is being brought in. But oftentimes, what we see is really lackluster results when compared to actual fasting. So we don't see a lot of reason to endorse that, but that is one of the categories that was looked at, in this study as well.
So when we look at the different, the key findings from this, and we look at the different intermittent fasting windows. So
Hmm.
um, time restricted eating, that's pretty straightforward. Fast mimicking diet, you just talked about it, right? So it's going to
Hmm.
be 5 days a month. You're going to do a very specific plant based strategy, right? Um, Twice per week fasting, TWF, and periodic fasting were kind of new to us in the way that they described it.
Yeah.
And when we were prepping to kind of go over it, you had an interesting way to kind of compare the 5-2 diet to what the twice a week fasting was, and then the
Yeah.
periodic fasting is sort of what we do inside of our challenges and our coaching, but kind of not, right?
Yeah. It's kind of a hybrid between these two categories. Essentially, when we talk about fast cycling and effective ways to get results with fasting in a consistent way. So, in this study particularly, when they categorized twice per week fasting, what they were talking about was can be similar to the 5-2 diet, if you've heard that term, but also a little bit broader too, where you have 2 days per week that we call them flame days, when those are no food days, those are 0 calorie days, and those could be consecutive or non-consecutive. Typically, in with a 5-2 regimen, we see it described as non-consecutive days. But when you go to consecutive days, that gets pretty interesting, because then you're getting into the 50 to 60 to 70 hour range for one of your fasts, which is an incredibly effective protocol right there that a lot of people don't get into. But as we get better at that fasting range, we can see new results for sure, and we'll get into that with some of the results from this study. The other one that we were looking at was the periodic fasting, and so in that's kind of loosely defined as somewhere between 48 hours all the way up to a 1 week fast, typically in the literature, and then usually that's done once every couple of weeks, maybe a couple of times per month, and then limited on the long term, like limited in the number of times that it's done per year. So there aren't a whole lot of research studies that actually describe that or use that protocol, but that was one of the categories that was used here in this meta analysis too.
Yeah. So for big picture overview, if we got lost in the weeds there, and I want to
Mhm.
summarize it kind of in a way, and I intentionally wanted to kind of slog through the different definitions,
Mhm.
is TRE is going to be, what you're typically used to, specific time window, 8 to 10 hours. 5-2
Okay.
fasting or twice a week fasting, which you've explained, right, is going to be 5 days a week, very low calorie diet, eating normally for 5 days a week, excuse me, and then consuming very low calorie or no food on those non consecutive days, right? So we could get those longer fasting windows.
Hmm.
that you just talked about, which will be one of our action steps here. Is I don't remember how you named it, but it was really cool in terms of the new decade, right?
Okay.
The fast mimicking diet we talked about briefly, and then the periodic. This is the coolest one to me because it's like, well, what do? You're alternating between periods of normal eating and complete fasting for specific days, fasting 1 or 2 days a week. Kind of like,
Mm.
what does that look like?
Yeah.
And if we're looking at the results of those 4 different categories and all these different types, is when we look at the significant differences, right, between the IF regimens, all of them were superior to the regular conventional diet in testing.
Mm.
Interestingly enough, calorie restriction alone ranked highest in terms of fasting glucose levels. So for insulin resistance specifically, all of the IF regimens had improvements, but there was no big statistical significance between which fasting window strategy you chose. That's how I want to word it. For
Mm.
fasting glucose, calorie restriction ranked the highest, followed by the twice a week or the TRE. For A1C, the periodic fasting, but I want to call this fasting freelancing in our world.
Right.
Kind of willy-nilly, don't really know. I'll fast here, then I'll go back to doing what I was doing, then I'll fast here, then I'll do maybe a longer fast here, then I'll do a couple days here, then I'll
Yeah.
right.
Pinball. I'm a pinball faster. Just
However,
kind of all
pinball
over the place.
faster,
Yeah.
slightly better, not overly statistically significant when compared
Mm.
to the other fasting interventions. And then all of the IF interventions were generally effective in reducing BMI, so getting the weight off. Win-win, right?
Hmm.
So when we're looking at the results, you could choose any one of these and you will see improvement. And they were all kind of just a little bit higher or lower in all of those different categories.
Mm.
So the takeaway for me there is, well, if you are doing some fasting and you're struggling with consistency, then I would probably encourage you to reduce the number of decisions that you need to make on a day-to-day basis.
Mm.
If you are fasting with some consistency and you've maybe plateaued or you're like, I don't know if this is sustainable. I really feel like I want to do a longer fast, but I haven't really figured out how to do that yet. Then I love your concept, Tommy, that you unpacked when we were prepping for today's conversation about this new fasting decade.
Well, when we talk about the new fasting decade, um, think about it as like your high watermark. So what's your longest fast, so far? And then if we look at the data here and we see that we start to get really, really good results as we get into this twice a week fasting, including maybe a 36 or a 40 to a 50 to even up to a 70-hour fast. And the results that are on the other side of that, that makes me want to be hyper focused on, okay, what have I been able to accomplish? Maybe if I'm newer to fasting, maybe it's only been a 16-hour fast, and that's the farthest I've gone. But at a certain point, have I done a 20? Have I done a 24-hour fast? Have I gotten to the 36-hour point or the 48-hour point or even beyond that? And so I like to think about that as an important kind of line in the sand. And it's easy to set my new little bit of a stretch goal because we know new results lie outside of our comfort zone. It lies beyond what we've been able to do in the past. So setting that next target as like maybe just pushing outside of that boundary a little bit, getting to that next decade is a really, really good target to reach for, after seeing what's possible here within these fasting protocols.
So what we've seen inside of thousands of people going through our fasting challenge, hundreds and hundreds of people in our 3 or 6 month coaching program, thousands and thousands of emails and messages, just like the shout out we gave at the beginning
Mhm.
today, for the most recent 5-star review. They're like, oh, I just got caught up. I went through all of it. Right.
Right.
So that's great. Like, you now have all the knowledge. I would love to know your results and how you're doing, because it's the application that matters, right? And we
Mhm.
get tons and tons of messages now that we've seen, about the results that people have gotten with fasting, just like we have. And that's incredible. Now, everybody's journey is going to be a little bit different. Everybody's life is a little bit different. Everybody's little day to day is a little bit different. So we've seen though that this, there's a blockade, right? There's a wall or a hurdle typically at that 20 to 24 hour mark, right?
Mm-hmm.
The going overnight without food,
Sure.
right?
Yeah.
Then there's another sticking point, interestingly enough, at that approaching 48-hour mark.
Mm-hmm. Especially with insulin resistance.
Especially with insulin resistance, especially in this group, right?
Mm-hmm.
But these are the results. The results of this study show that that's where the magic lies overall. It edged it out slightly, right?
Mm-hmm.
In terms of insulin resistance. But then there's also a really big sticking point, right? At that 60 to 72 hour mark.
For sure. You've talked about it a lot.
It's been a personal kick in the face for me on my fasting journey.
A nemesis.
Yeah, it's been my nemesis, right?
Yeah.
It's gotten easier. I don't do it as frequently, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you think the more you do it, the easier it would get. Not necessarily. But that's the concept of the fact, like, okay, what are you doing? Where's your level of confidence in application, right? Not just consuming the knowledge, but actually applying it.
Mm-hmm.
And then ultimately, what would the next step look like for you? Where would that next, breakthrough kind of be is where I want to go.
Yeah. Where are those new results? What's just beyond what's comfortable that you feel like you can pull off if you need to, or on a consistent basis to continue making progress? I think that's a really important way to look at it. And that's kind of the opposite of pinballing around and things being kind of random and more freelancing, which is very easy, to kind of get into that mode because there's no fasting police. There's no one making you be consistent. I don't even necessarily have to use the word disciplined about it, but there's no one who's making you do that. And that's like one of the main benefits of if you're tracking calories and tracking macros and things like that. It can feel like you know all the rules that you need to follow, whether you are or you're not. It's set in stone, right there for you to follow. And then it's just a decision whether or not to follow it. Whereas fasting is kind of more prone to freelancing. But if you look at it a little bit differently and start to think about it as, I need to set a fasting timer each day or so many times per week. And this is my level of, yes, I'm committed to it. And yes, I'm consistent with it. And then now I can fill in the blanks for what am I actually going to do here, which would be making sure that I'm hitting that next decade mark, at some point soon. So I can begin to feel more comfortable with a little bit longer fast so I can see a little bit different results that are on the other side of that. I mean, now we're getting some serious momentum. Now we're making inroads into my layers of insulin resistance here. Even if I don't have much weight to lose, or maybe if you do, then either way, it's going to be very helpful, and you're starting to dig into that, and you're making progress on things that are moving the needle underneath the hood, which is like, hey, here's my fasting glucose. I thought it was interesting that caloric restriction actually won on fasting glucose, had the best effect on fasting glucose, but that was the only category, and the most.
Hold on. So guess what the easiest way to get into to reduce your caloric intake is?
What is it?
Fasting in any form.
All right.
Oh yeah. Huh. Fasting's easy, but not simple in application. It's easy in concept. Don't eat. Okay. For how long? Great. Then what do I do? Right. So I want to go into where you were just going with the calorie restriction, the notable impact. I want to read it right from the research study before we wrap up. Before that though, I want to make sure that the action can be taken. So if you're listening going, lots of words, lots of fasting, not really sure the outcome, here's the outcome. Is all the fasting interventions showed improvement versus conventional diet. If you're looking for guidance, head to the show notes, grab the Blueprint to Fasting for Fat Loss. It has different fasting schedules, different ramp ups. little bit of the science, a little bit of the why, right? It'll be a resource for you.
Mm-hmm.
Join a challenge. If you want to go through a accelerated learning curve and you want to be challenged and pushed gently outside of your comfort zone, sign up for the next 7-day Master Your Fasting Lifestyle Challenge. We talk about fasting and schedules. We've got different incantations of applying that to you and your life for that week so you can get the best success, break through that plateau, get some consistency and confidence, etc. When we go to the relevant results, the twice a week fasting, right, and the periodic fasting, and the fast mimicking diet, here's the exact wording, right, in the summary is the TWF scores highest in HOMA-IR and BMI. So easy to do, right? Twice a week fasting, but not great for the main metric of diabetes or insulin resistance, HOMA-IR. Now, time restricted eating, which is varying those windows like we talked about, most effective for A1C and come in second place for fasting plasma glucose, right?
Mm-hmm.
Calorie restriction, to what you were saying, shows a notable impact only in fasting plasma glucose. So to your point, great on the surface, but not great under the hood.
Yeah. We want to dig deeper. We want to go deeper with the results here. So looking at it as it's the one that you could see the needle moving the fastest. Like if you're measuring your own blood sugar at home, maybe a Keto Mojo or some other device like that, you could see an improvement. And that's a really good thing. But to go a layer deeper and actually look at what's happening over the 90-day period for my A1C, what's moving the needle as far as insulin resistance with the HOMA-IR. These things are actually having a much, much better improvement with the fasting protocols versus the caloric restriction. And I want to emphasize one thing again, which is fast mimicking diet. Fast mimicking diet was number 3 or number 4, was like at the end of the race here on almost all of these metrics. Well, essentially all of these fasting. Yeah, and the reason why I don't want to beat a dead horse here for fast mimicking diet, but the reason I bring it up again is because if you think about it, we hear a lot of conversation about, yeah, but if I put this in my coffee, is it going to have that much of a blood sugar effect and things like that? There's a lot of times we hear a lot of conversation about what can I do to bring in some food or some calories that have a minimal effect on my blood sugar while I'm fasting. And you go, well, that's not fasting at that point. You're fast mimicking essentially at that point. So whether you're doing an alternate day fasting, like a modified alternate day fasting, and then you have your probably 25% of your caloric intake coming in. Essentially, if it was a clean flame day, a burn day where it was zero food, 0 calories coming in, the results would be much, much better than if I was bringing in 25% of my calories at that point. If I'm bringing in 25% of my calories, I'm essentially treating it like a fast mimicking day like that. And the same thing goes for the 5-2 diet and other modified protocols. So again, looking towards that next decade mark for your longest fasting time, or where you're comfortable executing a fast, and just getting that much cleaner with your next fast is a really, really worthwhile goal, because the results are significantly better versus treating that like a fast mimicking protocol.
100%. So a couple of overall big picture takeaways, right? When we were talking about the different categories. So TWF, TRE, most effective for improving insulin resistance and glucose metabolism, right?
Mm-hmm.
They're FMD, fast mimicking, and periodic kind of freelancing, pinballing, showed lower effectiveness across the outcomes compared to the others, right?
Yeah.
And the effectiveness of the FMD and PF are less pronounced, suggesting they might be less suitable for immediate metabolic improvements.
Yes, agreed.
Right? So,
mm-hmm.
What's the best fasting window for you? Well, you're going to have to stay consistent with something that fits your lifestyle. Because what's the best fasting window? What's the best diet? What's the best workout program? Well, the one you can stick to,
Yeah.
right? So the fasting blueprint, joining a challenge, getting some coaching, accelerating that learning curve, finding the tools or things that you can apply. Because we talked about this recently inside of our VIP coaching group. And it's this concept of the definition of insanity, right?
Mhm.
And I'm sure you've heard this a bajillion times. That's a word. The definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, but expecting a different result. But that's not really true. If you look it up in the dictionary, it's the state of being seriously mentally ill. Are we saying that we're all seriously mentally ill? No. But we do have to think of this a little bit differently. So if you're attempting similar strategies, but still hoping you'll finally get it right this time, that's actually a solid trait of perseverance.
Mhm.
But we'd rather not see you stuck on the hamster wheel.
Yeah, right.
Right?
Tenacity is good, but tenacity plus no new results equals frustration.
Right. So what needs to be different to get a different outcome when it comes to fasting? Well, I'd look at your daily routine. I'd look at your fasting timer. I'd look at your social circle. I'd look at your level of consistency or effort. I would look at what resources you have, what tools you have, where your mindset is when it comes to setting your timer or breaking your fast.
Yes, commitment. Yeah, that commitment at the time of setting the timer. That's a big one.
Yeah, so you're not certifiably insane for doing the same thing over again, but hoping for a different result. You're either comfortable, maybe a little stubborn, maybe do you really want that different result? Right? Because if you truly want that different result, then you got to do something different. So that's where we need to look at, like I said, the routine, the circle, the level of effort, the resources, the mindset. And hopefully some of the stuff that we have for you on the website, thefastingforlife.com, in the show notes, the blueprint to fasting for fat loss, the challenges that we do, where you can get a fast-tracked, week of support and live training. Those are the things that we ultimately want you to do in terms of strategy. But today, what can you do in terms of daily action? Well, you can pick one or two things that we just mentioned that you can apply, that you can make one different shift in your timer, your mindset, your food choices today that will lead to a long-term win. And that's really ultimately we want for everybody, right, Tommy?
Yeah, go for that. Go for that next decade mark, and clean up your next fast. Go for a clean fast instead of a fast mimicking or like a 25% day. And try that on for size and see how you feel, see what the results do, and then make a plan for the next time that you'll push that even a little bit further. Maybe it's another week from now, and that's just a cool way to build confidence, insulate your mindset, and build those, continue to sharpen those fasting tool belt, those tools in your fasting tool belt.
I love it. All right, cool conversation around the research article. If you're looking for the article itself and you want to nerd out, you can head to the show notes and check it out. The effects of different intermittent fasting regimens in people with type 2 diabetes and network meta-analysis. Really cool jumping off point for us from the Frontiers in Nutrition journal. So, Tommy, lots of action steps you can take today. Find the one that most resonates with you. We'll see you inside the Facebook community. We'll see you inside the upcoming challenge. Reach out to us if you've got questions, and happy to be on this fasting journey with y'all. Always appreciate the conversation, sir, and we'll talk soon.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
So, you've heard today's episode, and you may be wondering, where do I start? Head on over to thefastingforlife.com and sign up for our newsletter, where you'll receive fasting tips and strategies to maximize results and fit fasting into your day-to-day life.
While you're there, download your free Fast Start guide to get started today. Don't forget to subscribe on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Make sure to leave us a 5-star review, and we'll be back next week with another episode of Fasting for Life.